We believe that government's main purpose is to protect our individual freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and economic freedom, underpinned by a respect for private property rights, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We believe that government's job is to set the rules of the game and to enforce them and to keep them consistent, and then to get out of the way and allow for businesses to compete. We believe that government should not be a first resort, that it should be a last resort, and that individuals and families and communities should be free to govern themselves in their own way without a whole lot of interference. Government decision-making should be decentralized, that the level of government that's closest to the people is the best able to make decisions in the interests of those they serve, whether that be the local school board, the local hospital board, or the local city or town council. And importantly, we believe that government is a democracy, and that applies as much to its own caucus and cabinet as it does to its relationship with the electorate. We do not believe, for instance, when an MLA is elected, that they work for the leader of their party. We believe they work principally and foremost for the people who elected them. This is the reason why Guy Boudelier, after spending a year outside as an independent, chose to join our caucus. He wanted to see if we really walked our talk. And what he found is that our caucus, we have free votes on every issue that comes before the legislature. Now, most of the time, our MLAs agree with one another, but some of the time they don't. And when they don't, they vote differently. They vote in the best interest of their constituents. And the world hasn't come to an end because sometimes our MLAs disagree with each other. I think it's made our caucus stronger. And I think certainly restoring the free vote is going to be essential to restoring democracy in Alberta. Who knows, it might just catch on in other places too. Wildrose, we value free enterprise, we value limited government, we value personal freedom, and we value democracy. And generally I find that Albertans share these values. But the important thing is when you're firmly grounded in values, it can translate into policy quite easily. So let me just use a couple of examples to show you how our values translate into solutions for some of the problems facing the Alberta government today. Wade made reference to some of the work we've done on property rights, and I'll touch on that briefly. What we fear is with some bills that have come before the legislature, it's making Alberta into a central planner's dream. For some of you who may live in the Sherwood Park area, you know all about Bill 50, which is the Electric Statutes Amendment Act. That allows the government to force through transmission lines, whether we need them or not. There's Bill 19, the Land Assembly Project Areas Act. It allows the government to assemble large tracts of land for public projects and limit the amount of compensation that they pay to the landowner. And the third one is the land use framework. And I'll spend a minute talking about that because it's been in the news for the last week or so with the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan that came about. The way this act works is it divides the province into 7 regional planning areas based roughly on watershed. So we've got a few regions, the upper piece, the lower piece, the Lower Athabasca, the Upper Athabasca, the North Saskatchewan, the South Saskatchewan, and the Red Deer River. The Act authorizes Cabinet, and this is key, it puts the power in the hands of Cabinet to determine what all the land uses should be in the province on every acre of land, whether it's Crown land or whether it's private land. It allows the Cabinet to extinguish landowner and leaseholder rights. That's the current wording in the Act. They decided to change it because they realized that was getting people angry. So now it allows them to rescind existing leases and rights under licenses, under permits, under leases, under approvals, or under any other form of government approval issued, either by the Alberta government, issued by a municipality, or issued by a government agency. So what does that mean? Well, it means the government can now rescind a development permit, or rescind a water license, or a feedlot permit, or a forest management agreement, or a grazing lease or permit, or a mineral license, or as we've seen this past week, a mining permit or an oil sands lease. The Act also restricts rights to compensation. So the companies that get caught up in this are forced to try to negotiate with government without actually having full rights to compensation guaranteed. And also a regional plan applies retroactively, so it can apply not only to things that you might do on land, but also on current activities that are taking place on it. And it takes paramountcy over all other legislation. It is the highest law on the land. But importantly, and this is the first time we've seen this in government legislation, they've created a statutory bar against any court action. What does that mean? It means there's no appeal to the courts. So what does this mean for the investors who invested in the companies that are impacted by the lower Athabasca regional plan? Well, we don't really know yet. What we know with that plan is that they set aside 22% of the land in that area for no development. And it means that there's 24 companies that have the potential to have their leases canceled. 10 oil sands companies and 14 mineral companies. They have to negotiate for compensation, and the government has already indicated that they're going to limit compensation to the amount of money that they paid for the development of the lease and the purchase of the lease. And the other thing we've heard is that for some companies, the small ones, CAP has said that they may be wiped out. Some of these companies, when they go out and buy a lease, that's the only asset they hold, and then they go out to the market and try to get investors to invest in their company. When you wipe out that lease, you've essentially wiped out the company. Now, the government says that these are marginal lands, but I think the thing we have to keep in mind with development, especially oil sands development, is all of this stuff was considered marginal at one point. And yet we're continuing to develop new technologies almost every year to be able to develop these resources. So the question will be, what happens to these companies? I think the bigger question is what happens to others who are caught up in the other regional plans. Because as I say, this doesn't just apply to oil and gas companies. It also can apply to landowners who have water rights for agriculture purposes, for grazing leases, or somebody who's just got a development permit to subdivide their land. The question now is what is going to happen to those landowners, and the answer is we just simply don't know. Our party believes that Albertans need a government that is going to create an environment that respects contracts. So when they make a deal's a deal, that respects property rights, that respects leases, and that ensures that businesses, both big and small, can invest and can grow with confidence in Alberta. If the Wildrose was elected to form government, our first order of business would be to pass an Alberta Property Rights Preservation Act, so that those who are impacted by bills like this, where there's about 50 others that are like this, can be guaranteed full, fair, and timely compensation and ensure that they have access to the courts. This would ensure that in this province, we create an environment where property rights are paramount, perhaps for the first time in our country's history. I just want to switch gears a bit and talk about another area that our party has been spending a lot of time on, the budget deficit. We called the last two provincial budgets a train wreck, and we believe they are. The budget from 2 years ago carried a budget deficit of $4.7 billion, the biggest in our province's history. The one this past year projects a deficit of $3.4 billion, second biggest in our province's history. And it doesn't stop there, because the government is now also changing the way it calculates its cash shortfall. If they borrow money for capital purposes, they don't include that in their deficit figures. So that adds about another $2 to $3 billion in cash shortfall this year. Now, just to understand how out of whack that is, consider this: we're still planning on bringing in about $8 billion in resource revenue this year, and yet we're running a shortfall of about $6 billion. We would need $14 billion in resource revenue to be able to balance the books. We've never had that amount of money in resource revenues in our history. This is not a revenue problem that we have, it's a spending problem. And it's a problem that economists and commentators have been talking about for more than a decade. You may have seen that after the government released their budget, we released our alternative budget, because we believe that we can put forward a very simple plan for how we would get back into budget balance. We called this actually our 3-step recovery program for a spending-addicted government.